The scent of fear was a currency in the great hall. It was sharp and metallic, like blood on a whetstone, mingling with the sour odor of unwashed bodies and cheap ale. Alara breathed it in, letting it fill her lungs, a familiar poison. She stood on the cold stone of the auction block, a slip of a girl in a threadbare tunic, her bare feet numb against the floor. She could not see the faces leering up at her, the mocking smiles or the pitiless eyes. She had been born into a world of darkness, her eyes sealed by a fate her pack deemed a curse. But she saw more than they ever could. She saw the world in soul light. Every living thing radiated a color, a texture, a sound that was uniquely its own. The pack alpha, her own uncle who had dragged her here, was a jagged shard of rust-red greed, scraping against the air with every breath. The warriors below were a muddled chorus of muddy browns and dull grays, their souls coarse and simple, driven by base needs. This was the mating ritual, a day that should have been for hope. For other she-wolves, it was a chance to be chosen, to find a mate and begin a life. For Alara, it was the final humiliation. She was the blind Omega, the useless mouth, the defective runt of the Blackwater pack. She could not hunt, she could not fight, and her strange, unnerving pronouncements about the colors of people's feelings had long ago marked her as an outcast. So she was being sold. Not for mating, but for servitude. A scullery maid, a field hand, whatever fate the highest bidder deemed fit for a broken thing. A strong back, despite her flaw, the auctioneer boomed, his voice a slick, oily green in Alara's perception. He yanked her arm, forcing her to turn. Hardly eats a thing. And silent. She will not trouble your halls with a woman's chatter. A lie. She was not mute. She simply had learned that her words were worthless in a world that valued only what it could see with its eyes. Her silence was a shield, the only armor she had ever been afforded. Laughter rippled through the crowd. It was a cruel sound, like stones rattling in a tin can. The bidding started low. A farmer whose soul was the color of parched dirt offered 3 copper pieces. A tanner, smelling of chemicals and decay, his soul a sickly yellow, offered 5. Ilara stood perfectly still, her face a placid mask. Inside, her own soul, a soft, trembling thing the color of twilight lavender, curled in on itself. She retreated to the only safe place she knew, her memories. She remembered her mother, a warm, golden light snuffed out too soon, her voice a melody of comfort. "Your sight is not a curse, my little moonflower," she had whispered. "It is a gift. You see the truth of things. One day it will save you." One day seemed a very long way off. The bidding stalled at 10 coppers, a pittance, an insult. Her uncle's rust-red soul flared with angry frustration. He had hoped for at least a silver. A sudden hush fell over the hall. It was so abrupt, so complete, that Alara felt it as a physical pressure against her skin. The cacophony of soul lights, the muddy browns and greasy greens all dimmed as if a great shadow had fallen over them. A new presence had entered the hall. This new soul was impossible. It was not one color, but a storm. At its heart was a light of the purest, most brilliant silver she had ever perceived, a light so intense it sang like a struck crystal. But wrapped around it, choking it, was a maelstrom of shadow. It was the black of a starless midnight, cold and vast and edged with a terrifying violet rage. The two forces, silver and shadow, warred with each other, a silent, eternal battle that radiated a cold so profound it stole the breath from her lungs. Her inner wolf, a creature she rarely felt, a dormant spirit deep within her, stirred for the first time in years. It lifted its head, whining softly, a sound of both terror and recognition. Mate. The word was not a thought, but an instinct, a primal certainty that shook her to her very core. Impossible. Her mate could not be this tempest of light and darkness. King Galen, someone breathed from the crowd, the name laced with awe and fear, the Shadow King of the North. Elara had heard the tales, a ruthless conqueror who had carved his kingdom from the frozen peaks, a warrior of unparalleled strength whose heart was said to be carved from the same ice as his fortress. They said he was more beast than man, that his rage could level armies, that he tolerated no weakness. His reputation was a living thing in the hall, a palpable wave of fear that washed over the lesser alphas. Their souls flickered and shrank before his. A voice cut through the silence. It was low and resonant, a sound like grinding stone, yet it carried to every corner of the hall. The sound of it vibrated against Elara's bones, and she saw it in her mind's eye as a deep, consuming indigo. Her. Just one word. A command. The auctioneer stammered. Your Majesty, she is but a flawed Omega, hardly worthy of... I did not ask for your assessment. The king's voice sliced back, colder now. The shadows in his soul churned, and a wave of pure menace rolled through the room. I will have her. Name the price. Elara's uncle, his rusty soul now shimmering with avarice, saw his chance. 1,000 gold pieces for the inconvenience, Your Majesty, he declared, his voice trembling with audacity. Gasps echoed through the hall. It was a king's ransom, an amount that could buy 100 healthy, strong she-wolves, not one blind, useless Omega. Elara felt a fresh wave of humiliation. He was making a mockery of the king, using her as a pawn. The king would surely strike him down for such insolence. Instead, the king's second-in-command, a man whose soul was a steady, loyal gray like granite, stepped forward. Without a word, he unfastened a heavy pouch from his belt and threw it to the ground at her uncle's feet. It landed with a deafening thud, the metallic clink of gold coins spilling onto the stone floor. The entire hall was stunned into silence. No one spoke. No one moved. The air was thick with disbelief. The Shadow King had just paid a fortune for a broken Omega. The granite-souled man, his name she would later learn was Galen, walked to the auction block. His steps were heavy and certain. He reached her and, with a surprising gentleness, untied the rough rope that bound her wrists. His touch was firm but not cruel. Come, girl, he said, his voice gruff but without the malice she was used to. The king awaits. Elara could not move. Her feet were rooted to the spot. Her mind reeled. Why? Why would a man like King Galen, a creature of such immense power and terrifying darkness, want her? What could he possibly see in a girl who could not see at all? She felt the king's attention on her. It was a physical weight, an intense pressure that made her skin tingle. His soul storm was focused entirely on her, the silver and the shadow swirling in a vortex of raw, possessive energy. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. And deep within that storm, she felt something else, a flicker of, what? Not kindness, not pity, something far more complex. A sliver of his silver light reached for her, a tentative, questioning note in the overwhelming symphony of his power. It was a note of profound, aching loneliness. It resonated with the hollow space in her own chest, the place where hope had long since died. For the first time, Elara did not feel like a broken thing being sold. She felt seen, truly seen, in a way no one with working eyes ever had. Taking a shaky breath, she allowed Galen to lead her off the block, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. She walked through the parted crowd, their shock and confusion a tangible buzzing energy around her. She kept her head held high, her spine straight. She was walking away from a life of shame and into the heart of a storm. She did not know if it would save her or destroy her. But as she walked toward the Shadow King, she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her life had just been irrevocably changed. The journey to the northern citadel was a blur of sensation. The rumble of the carriage wheels, the scent of pine and cold stone, the heavy weight of the fur blanket Galen had wrapped around her. He had not spoken another word to her, his granite-gray soul a silent, watchful presence beside her. Ilara had remained silent as well, her inner world a tempest of confusion. The king did not ride with them. He rode ahead on a great black war horse, a silent specter leading the way. But she could feel his soul storm constantly, a distant, thrumming power on the edge of her perception. It was like feeling the approach of a thunderstorm long before the first drop of rain. The citadel, when they finally arrived, was a fortress of ice and shadow. She did not need to see it to know its nature. The air grew bitingly cold, and the very stones beneath the carriage wheels felt ancient and saturated with sorrow. The wind that whipped around its towers did not whistle. It mourned. She was led through echoing halls where the footfalls of guards were the only sound. Their souls were like shards of flint, hard, sharp, and without warmth. This was a place built for war, not for comfort. A place where weakness was carved out and discarded. What am I doing here? The question echoed in the hollows of her mind, a blind omega in the heart of a warrior king's fortress. It was a lamb wandering into a wolf's den. She was taken to a small, sparse chamber. It contained a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a single high window through which she could feel the faint cold light of a distant moon. It was a cell, but it was cleaner and warmer than any place she had ever slept in her life. A servant, a timid woman whose soul was the color of a frightened mouse, brought her a simple meal of bread and broth and a fresh tunic of soft, dark wool. The kindness was so unexpected it felt like a trap. Days bled into one another. No one spoke to her. No one told her what was expected of her. She was a ghost in the citadel, confined to her room, a forgotten purchase left on a shelf. The isolation was a familiar cloak, but the waiting was a new kind of torture. She spent her hours sitting by the high window, tracing the patterns of the cold air on her skin and listening. She listened to the sounds of the citadel, the clang of steel from the training yard, the guttural shouts of warriors, the low hum of a fortress always on alert. And she listened with her other sense, mapping the souls within these walls. They were all shades of gray, steel, and stone. A kingdom built on duty and discipline, devoid of warmth or color. And always she felt him, the king. His soul storm was the heart of the citadel, a constant brooding presence that pulsed through the very stones. Sometimes the shadows within him would rage, a violent tempest she could feel even from her distant room, and on those nights, a collective fear would settle over the fortress. Other times, the silver light at his core would shine brighter, a brief, piercing moment of clarity and sorrow that made her own heart ache in sympathy. He never summoned her. He never came near her. She began to wonder if he had forgotten her entirely. Perhaps buying her had been a whim, a moment of inexplicable madness he now regretted. The thought brought a strange, sharp pang of disappointment. One evening, the door to her chamber opened. It was not the mousy servant. It was Galen. His granite soul was as steady as ever. "The king will see you," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her resignation. This was it. She would finally learn her fate. Her hands trembled as she stood, smoothing down the soft wool of her tunic. Galen led her not to the throne room as she had expected, but up a winding staircase to the highest tower of the citadel. The air grew warmer as they ascended. They stopped before a set of heavy oaken doors. Galen pushed one open and gestured for her to enter. He did not follow. Alara stepped inside, and the door closed behind her, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing in the sudden silence. The room was warm. A massive fireplace crackled and hissed, casting a dancing heat that kissed her skin. The air smelled of burning wood, old parchment, and something else. Something wild and clean, like the air after a lightning strike. It was the scent of the king himself. She could feel his presence across the room. The storm of his soul was overwhelming at this proximity. The shadows were a living, breathing entity, coiling in the corners of the chamber. The silver light at his core was so bright it was almost painful to perceive. "Come closer," he commanded. His voice was that same grinding stone, but here, in the intimacy of his private chambers, it held a rougher, more personal edge. She moved forward cautiously, her bare feet silent on a thick fur rug. She stopped when the heat from the fire was strong on her face. She could feel him sitting in a large chair near the hearth. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. What did he want from her? "They tell me you are blind," he said finally. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. "Yes, Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And yet," he continued, his voice laced with a strange intensity, "at the auction, you looked at me. Not at my face. At me." Alara's breath hitched. He had noticed. Of course he had noticed. A man like him would miss nothing. How could she explain what she saw? That she had seen the warring tempest of his soul, the beautiful, tragic light being strangled by darkness? I do not understand, Your Majesty," she lied, her only defense. A low growl rumbled in his chest. The shadows in the room deepened. "Do not lie to me, girl. I paid a fortune for you, not for lies. I saw the recognition in your posture. You were not looking at a king. You were looking at a man." He was right. In that moment she had seen past the fearsome reputation, past the crown and the power, and had seen the prisoner within the storm. She remained silent, her fear warring with a strange, inexplicable urge to tell him the truth. He rose from his chair. The sheer force of his presence intensified as he moved toward her. He was a mountain of a man. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the power thrumming in his muscles. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel his breath stir the fine hairs at her temple. "What did you see?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous command. Her courage, a tiny, flickering ember, chose that moment to catch flame. She lifted her chin, her sightless eyes aimed toward the sound of his voice. "I saw a storm," she said, her own voice trembling but clear. "I saw a light like a captive star, fighting against a sea of shadow." The air crackled with tension. The king went utterly still. The churning chaos of his soul seemed to freeze, caught in a moment of pure shock. For a heartbeat, the silver light flared, eclipsing the darkness completely. It was a look of raw, unguarded astonishment. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her chin, tilting her face upward. His touch was not brutal, as she had expected. It was hesitant, searching. It sent a jolt of lightning through her entire body. How? He breathed, the word a gust of disbelief. How can you see that? This was the moment, the precipice. Tell him and risk everything or retreat back into the safety of her lies. Her mother's words echoed in her memory. It will save you. My eyes are blind, Your Majesty, she explained, her voice gaining strength. But I see the truth of things. I see the light of a person's soul. Yours. Yours is brighter and more terrible than any I have ever known. He did not pull away. His thumb stroked softly against her skin, a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it made her knees weak. The chaotic storm of his soul began to calm, the shadows receding slightly, the silver light pulsing with a steady, wondering rhythm. For years, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name, no one has seen anything but the monster. The Shadow King. He spoke the title with a self-loathing that was a physical blow. They look at me and see only darkness. But you look at me and see a star. He sounded broken. The great feared king, the ruthless conqueror, sounded like a lost man who had finally been found. In that moment, her fear of him evaporated, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it stole her breath. Her inner wolf, which had been cowering in the face of his power, now felt a different urge, an instinct to soothe, to comfort. Without thinking, she lifted her hand and placed it over his on her chin. His skin was warm, his hand large and strong, covering hers completely. At her touch, the silver light in his soul surged, a brilliant, hopeful flare that pushed back the shadows. He inhaled sharply, as if she had touched a live wire. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Ilara." "Ilara," he repeated, and her name on his lips was a strange and beautiful sound. "You are not a servant. You are not a slave. I do not know what you are, but you will remain here, with me." It was not a request. It was a proclamation. He was claiming her, not as property, but as something else entirely, something he needed. He released her then, and the loss of his touch left her skin feeling cold. He moved back to the fire, the storm of his soul once again swirling, but it was different now. The silver and shadow were not at war. They were dancing, a slow, cautious dance of discovery. Ilara stood by the fire in the king's chambers, a blind Omega who had just looked into the soul of a monster and had not flinched. And in his soul, she had seen her own reflection. A tiny lavender light, no longer trembling, but glowing with a quiet, steady strength in the heart of his storm. Life in the citadel transformed. Ilara was no longer confined to the small, cold room. She was moved into a chamber adjoining the king's own, a spacious suite with thick furs on the floor and a fire that was never allowed to die. Servants, their souls now tinged with awe and confusion instead of just fear, attended to her needs, bringing her meals and soft woolen gowns. She was a curiosity, a mystery, the king's blind seer, they whispered in the halls. No one understood her sudden elevation, but no one dared question the king's command. Galen, for his part, became a constant presence in her life. He would summon her to his chambers each evening, they would sit by the fire, and he would speak to her. At first, his words were clipped, practical, speaking of battle strategies and the politics of his kingdom, as if testing her. But Ilara did not listen to his words alone. She listened to the color of his soul as he spoke. When he talked of war, the shadows would churn, a deep, violent purple of rage and regret. When he spoke of his people, the silver light would pulse with a heavy, golden-tinged sense of duty. He was a king bound by a heavy chain, a man who carried the weight of his kingdom like a physical burden. She, in turn, began to speak to him. She told him of her own world, the world of soul light. She described the granite loyalty of Galen, the mousy fear of her handmaiden, the sharp, jealous green of a courtier who glared at her as she passed. Galen listened with a rapt intensity. For him, a man who lived in a world of stark truths and brutal realities, her perception was a form of magic he could not comprehend. "Tell me again," he would demand, his voice rough with fascination. "What color is honor?" "It is not one color," she would explain softly. "It is a weight. It feels like polished steel, heavy and cool and true. Galen has much of it. And deceit? Deceit is thin and slick, like oil on water. It has a sour, yellow-green smell. These conversations became their ritual, a slow, careful unwrapping of two lonely souls. In his presence, Alara found a safety she had never known. He was the most powerful and dangerous man she had ever met, yet with her, he was gentle. He would guide her with a hand on her elbow when they walked, his touch sending shivers of warmth through her. He would describe the view from the high tower, his deep voice painting pictures of snow-capped mountains and vast, dark forests, and for the first time, she did not feel the loss of her sight. She saw it all through his words, and in her presence, Galen began to change. The rages that used to shake the citadel became less frequent. The oppressive coldness that clung to him began to recede, replaced by a quiet intensity. The silver light of his soul grew stronger, brighter, a steady flame that held the encroaching shadows at bay. He was a man coming back to life. Intimacy grew in the quiet moments. One evening, as a fierce blizzard raged outside, he was tending to the fire. A log shifted, sending a shower of sparks onto the hearth. One landed on his ungloved hand. He hissed in pain, a sharp, guttural sound. Without thinking, Alara rushed to his side, kneeling on the rug before him. "Let me see," she said, her voice soft with concern. "It is nothing," he grunted, but he did not pull his hand away when she reached for it. Her fingers, sensitive and knowing, traced the back of his hand. It was a warrior's hand, calloused and scarred. She found the small burn on his knuckle. She brought his hand to her lips and, with a tenderness that surprised them both, she gently blew on the reddened skin. Galen went rigid. His entire soul flared, a supernova of silver light so brilliant it made her gasp. The shadows vanished completely for a breathtaking instant. In that moment, he was pure, untainted light. He made a choked sound in the back of his throat, a sound of raw, aching vulnerability. His other hand came up, cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin with a reverence that made her heart ache. His soul was a symphony of emotion she could barely decipher. Longing, disbelief, a fierce, desperate possessiveness that was both terrifying and thrilling. Her own inner wolf was howling, a joyous, triumphant song of recognition. Mate, our mate. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice thick and strained. The moment was electric, a fragile bubble of connection in the heart of the cold fortress. She leaned into his touch, her lavender soul reaching for his silver light, wanting to soothe the pain she knew he carried. A pain far deeper than a simple burn. But the moment was shattered by a sharp knock on the door. Galen snatched his hand back as if he had been burned again, the shadows crashing back into his soul with a vengeance. The light retreated, the walls went up, and the Shadow King returned. "Enter," he bit out, his voice once again cold as iron. The door opened to reveal a man Alara had not encountered before. He was tall and slender, dressed in the fine robes of a royal advisor. But his soul made her blood run cold. It was a void, where every other person had a color, a light, a texture. This man had nothing. It was a patch of utter emptiness, a chilling vacuum that seemed to suck the warmth and light from the room. It was the color of absolute despair. It was wrong, unnatural. Lord Vorlog, Galen said, his tone clipped. What is it? My apologies for the intrusion, Your Majesty, the man said. His voice was smooth and cultured, a silken sound that did nothing to hide the chilling emptiness Alara perceived. But matters of the southern border require your urgent attention. Alara felt Vorlog's attention shift to her. It was not a look. It was a cold, calculating assessment. The void of his soul seemed to probe at her, and she felt an instinctual urge to shield her own light, to hide from his awful emptiness. And this is the Omega, Vorlog said, his silken voice dripping with a condescension that was sharper than any blade. The little blind mouse who has so captured our king's attention. Galen's shadows roiled. You will show her respect, Vorlog, he snarled, a dangerous edge to his voice. She is under my protection. Of course, Your Majesty, Vorlog replied, but the emptiness of his soul pulsed with something that felt like amusement, a cold, cruel mockery. I merely worry for you, the court whispers. They say you grow soft, that this creature is a distraction, a weakness. The word weakness hung in the air, a deliberate poison. It was a word that had defined Alara's entire life, but hearing it from this man, this soulless thing, it felt like a physical blow. Galen stood up, his full height radiating menace. The court would be wise to hold its tongue. Leave us. Vorlog bowed, a slow, deliberate gesture of false deference. As you wish, my king. He turned and left, the door closing softly behind him, but the chill of his presence lingered. The fragile intimacy of the room was gone, shattered. Galen paced before the fire, his soul once again a raging storm of silver and shadow. The doubt Vorlog had planted had taken root. He was looking at her. She could feel it. But his gaze was now filled with conflict. He valued strength above all else. His kingdom was built on it. And she was the epitome of weakness in the eyes of his world, a blind, non-combative Omega. Vorlog was right. She was a liability, a chink in the Shadow King's armor. Perhaps he is right, she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackle of the fire. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Galen stopped pacing. Right about what? That I am a weakness, she said, forcing herself to be brave. I cannot fight. I cannot advise you on war. I am what they have always said I am. A flaw. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, gripping her by the shoulders. His grip was hard, almost painful, his desperation a tangible force. You are not weak, he growled, his face close to hers. You have a strength these fools cannot comprehend. You see the truth. That is a weapon more powerful than any sword. His soul flared with a fierce, protective light. You are mine, Alara, and I protect what is mine. His words should have been a comfort, but they were a cage. Mine. He saw her as a possession, a valuable, unique tool, not as a partner, not as a mate. The chasm between them, the chasm of king and subject, of powerful alpha and weak omega, yawned wide once more. She had allowed herself to hope. She had seen the lonely man behind the monster and had dared to believe he could see the strong woman behind the blind girl. But the world, with its cruel labels and rigid roles, had intruded. Lord Vorlag, with his empty soul and venomous words, had reminded them both of what they were. He was a king, and she was his flaw. The moon was a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky. Its faint light filtered through the arched window of the king's private garden, a place Ilara had never been before. Galen had led her there after dismissing Vorlag, his hand a firm, unwavering presence on the small of her back. The air was cold and crisp, smelling of damp earth and the delicate perfume of night-blooming moon-petal flowers, a scent like sweet sorrow. A stone bench sat beneath a weeping willow, its branches like skeletal fingers brushing the ground. He guided her to it, and they sat in silence, the space between them charged with unspoken words. The storm in his soul had not calmed. It was a tumultuous sea of conflict. The silver light of his affection for her warred with the shadowy violet of his duty, and his deep-seated fear of the curse that she now understood was a part of him. Vorlag's visit had shaken him, reminding him of the monster he always fought to keep caged. "This place is the only part of the citadel my mother planted," Galen said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be pulled from the depths of the earth. She said that even in the coldest stone, something beautiful could be made to grow. Ilara could feel the truth of it. The garden's soul was different from the rest of the fortress. It was a soft, gentle green, laced with the pale, silvery memory of a long-lost queen. A place of peace. "She must have been a very kind woman," Ilara whispered, sensing the deep well of grief he still carried for his mother. "She was," he affirmed, his voice thick. "She was the light of this kingdom. Before the darkness took her, before it took my father, before it began to take me." He was speaking of his curse, the shadows that clung to his soul. It was a hereditary blight, a creeping corruption passed down his line. He had never spoken of it so openly before. The vulnerability in his admission was a raw, open wound. "It is not you," Ilara said, turning toward him, her voice fierce with a certainty that came from her very soul. "The shadow is not you. I see you, Galen. I see the silver light. It is who you are." He let out a harsh, broken sound that was half laugh, half sob. He reached for her, his hands framing her face, his touch desperate. "You are the only one who does," he breathed, his forehead resting against hers. "Ilara, since you arrived, the shadows have been quieter. The rage is easier to control. When you are near me, I feel the man I was meant to be. I feel whole." The silver in his soul blazed, pouring into her, a wave of pure, unadulterated love and longing. It was overwhelming. It was everything her own soul had ever yearned for. The mate bond, undeniable and powerful, flared between them, a tangible cord of light connecting their hearts. "The bond," he whispered, his voice shaking with the force of his emotion. "The mate bond. I have felt it since the moment I saw you on that cursed block. My wolf knew you. It recognized you as its other half." He was declaring himself. Here, in the moonlight, in the ghost of his mother's garden, the Shadow King was baring his soul, offering her the one part of him that was not touched by darkness. Her heart shattered, because she had to refuse him. She had a secret, a vow sworn on her mother's grave. Her mother, a seer herself, had foreseen the coming of a great darkness that would threaten to consume the land. She had made Ilara promise. "You will never bind yourself to another, my little moonflower, until you find the one whose soul sings a song of pure silver. Not silver and shadow, not silver and gold. Pure, untainted silver. He is the only one who can stand against the coming night. To bind yourself to any other, especially one touched by the shadow, would be to feed the very darkness we must fight. Galen's soul was not pure silver, it was a war zone. To accept the mate bond, to pour her own light into his, might not save him. Her mother's prophecy suggested it might strengthen his curse, feeding the shadow with her energy until it consumed him completely. It would doom them both, and doom the kingdom. Tears streamed down her face, hot against her cold skin. The pain of what she had to do was a physical agony, a knife twisting in her gut. She had to reject her own mate. She had to break his heart to save him. She pulled back, wrenching her face from his hands. The loss of his touch was a searing pain. "No," she whispered, the word a shard of glass in her throat. Galen froze. The brilliant silver light in his soul flickered, faltered, as if struck by a mortal blow. The shadows, sensing their chance, surged forward with a terrifying hunger. "What?" he asked, his voice hollow with disbelief. "I cannot," she said, forcing the words out, each one a betrayal of her own heart. "I do not feel it. I am just a blind Omega. You are a king. We are not. We cannot be mates." She was lying. She was using the very words the world had always used against her, turning them into a weapon against the one person who had seen past them. It was the cruelest thing she had ever done. The silence that followed was absolute. She could feel the light in his soul dying. The beautiful, brilliant silver she had come to cherish was being extinguished, smothered by a tidal wave of shadow. The pain, the rejection, the betrayal. It was the perfect fuel for his curse. When he finally spoke, his voice was unrecognizable. It was flat, dead, devoid of all warmth, all emotion. It was the voice of the Shadow King in the flesh. "I see," he said. And the two words were a death sentence. He stood up. The warmth that had always radiated from him was gone, replaced by a glacial cold that was more terrifying than any rage. The air around him seemed to drop in temperature. "You have been a pleasant diversion," he said, his voice a monotone of ice. "But I have indulged this fantasy for long enough. Lord Vorlag was correct. You are a distraction." He turned and walked away, not even looking back. His soul was a vortex of pure, churning shadow. The silver light was gone, not dimmed. Gone, as if it had never existed. Ilara sat alone on the bench, shivering, her tears freezing on her cheeks. The gentle green soul of the garden seemed to recoil from the blast of cold he had left in his wake. She had done it. She had pushed him away. She had broken her own heart and snuffed out the light in his. She had saved him from the curse, but she had killed the man. All that was left was the monster. The next morning, she was moved from her comfortable chambers. No word was spoken. Two flint-soled guards simply appeared at her door and escorted her back down to the cold, damp cell she had first occupied. The soft woolen gown was taken, replaced by the rough servant's tunic she had arrived in. She was once again a prisoner, a forgotten thing. The king's blind seer was no more. She was just Ilara, the blind Omega, alone in the dark. But this darkness was different. It was a darkness of her own making, filled with the ghost of a silver light she had been forced to destroy, and it was infinitely, unbearably worse. The cold of the cell was absolute. It seeped into Ilara's bones, a physical manifestation of the despair that had taken root in her heart. The king did not summon her. Days turned into a week, a bleak, silent eternity, marked only by the meager meals pushed through a slot in the heavy wooden door. The citadel itself had changed. Through her soul sight she could feel the shift. The oppressive fear that had lessened during her time with Galen had returned with a vengeance. The souls of the guards and servants were brittle with anxiety. A deep, chilling cold had settled over the fortress, emanating from the king's tower like a plague. Galen's soul was a constant, distant agony. There was no light left, only the roiling, starless dark. He was lost in it. She had done this. She had thrown him to the wolves to save him from the storm, and now the wolves were feasting. Worse yet, she could feel Lord Vorlog's influence growing. His soulless void was no longer a peripheral presence. It was everywhere. It was a creeping poison, winding its way through the court, whispering in the ears of the guards. He was consolidating power in the vacuum left by Galen's descent into shadow. Her mother's warning echoed in her mind, a great darkness that would threaten to consume the land. This was it. Vorloj was the agent of that darkness, and Galen, his heart broken and his soul shrouded, was becoming its perfect vessel. Her rejection, meant to save him, had instead accelerated his damnation. One night, the door to her cell creaked open. It was not a guard. It was Galen. His granite soul was fractured with worry and grief. "He is fading," Galen said without preamble, his voice a low, desperate rumble. "The king. He does not eat. He does not speak. He just sits on his throne, and the shadows around him are growing. The healers cannot touch him. Vorlog says it is the final stage of the curse, that his mind is already gone." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. "Vorlog is lying." "I know," Galen agreed, his soul radiating a grim certainty. "Vorlog has convinced the council that the king is a danger, that he must be contained. For the good of the kingdom. He has them eating from the palm of his hand. He speaks of a purification ritual, a way to sever the cursed bloodline forever. Purification. Sever the bloodline." The words were a death knell. "He means to kill him," Ilara whispered in horror. "At dawn," Galen confirmed. "In the throne room. Vorlog has declared it a necessary sacrifice, and he has named you as the cause." "Me?" "He claims you are a witch," Galen explained, his words heavy. "That you ensnared the king with dark magic, weakened his mind, and accelerated the curse to clear a path for your own power. He has convinced them you are an agent of the southern mages. They are coming for you next." It was a perfect trap. Vorlog would eliminate his king, eliminate the one person who could see him for what he was, and seize control of the kingdom, all while playing the part of its savior. Ilara's despair solidified into a hard, cold resolve. She had made a terrible mistake. She had followed the letter of her mother's vow, but had ignored its spirit. She thought she was protecting Galen from the shadow, but she had only succeeded in starving his light, leaving him defenseless. The vow was not about finding a perfect, untainted soul. It was about finding a soul strong enough to fight the darkness. Galen's soul, with its brilliant silver core, had been that soul, and she had broken it. "I have to see him," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Galen shook his head. "It's impossible. Vorlog has the throne room sealed. No one is to enter until the ritual." "There has to be a way," she insisted, her mind racing. "A secret passage? Anything?" Galen hesitated, his granite soul warring with itself. He was a man of duty, of law. To help her would be treason. But his loyalty to Galen, the true Galen, was absolute. "There is one," he finally admitted. "A passage behind the throne, known only to the royal line and to the king's shield. Me. It is how I am to extract him in case of an attack on the throne room." Hope, a fragile, determined thing, bloomed in her chest. "Take me there." Navigating the dark, winding passages behind the walls of the citadel was terrifying. The air was stale and cold, the stone slick with dampness. Galen led the way, his hand a steadying presence on her arm, his soul a small beacon of loyalty in the oppressive dark. They stopped behind a section of wall. "We are behind the great tapestry that backs the throne," he whispered. "I can hear Vorlog on the other side. He is preparing his ritual." Elara pressed her ear to the cold stone, but she did not need her hearing. She could sense them. Vorlog's chilling void was a sucking maw of emptiness in the center of the room, and near it, Galen. His soul was a barely flickering ember of shadow, so faint she could almost not perceive it. He was almost gone. "The ritual is a lie," she whispered to Galen, a horrifying realization dawning on her. "It's not to kill him. It's to transfer the curse." "No, not the curse. The entity behind the curse. Vorlog wants to hollow Galen out completely and let the darkness wear his body like a suit of armor." Vorlog's voice drifted through the stone, smooth and triumphant. "The vessel is prepared. The bloodline is weakened. Let the eternal night claim its throne." There was no more time. "Open it," Elara commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she did not know she possessed. Galen hesitated for only a second before pressing a sequence of stones. With a low groan, a section of the wall slid aside, revealing the throne room. The sight that met her soul sense was a nightmare. Galen was slumped on the throne, pale and still, his eyes vacant. Creeping veins of black shadow crawled across his skin, visible even on his face. He was a puppet waiting for its master. Lord Vorlog stood before him, his hands raised, chanting in a guttural language that made the very air vibrate. He was flanked by two of his personal guards, their souls a dull, unquestioning iron. The moment the passage opened, Vorlog stopped chanting. His head snapped toward them, and the void of his soul pulsed with furious rage. "The witch!" he shrieked. "Seize her! She comes to interfere with the sacred rite." The two iron-souled guards charged. Galen met them head-on, his great sword singing as it left its scabbard. The clang of steel on steel echoed in the vast room. He was one man against two, but he was the king's shield, and his loyalty gave him the strength of 10. Elara did not hesitate. She ran. She stumbled across the cold floor, her bare feet slapping against the stone, her entire being focused on the dying ember that was Galen. "Galen!" she cried out, her voice filled with all the love and regret that was tearing her apart. She reached the dais. Vorlog stood in her way, his face a mask of fury. The emptiness of his soul was a tangible force, pushing against her, trying to snuff out her lavender light. "You will not ruin this, you pathetic creature," he hissed, raising a hand. A bolt of pure shadow, cold and cloying, shot from his fingertips. Elara cried out as it struck her. It was not a physical blow. It was a spiritual one. It was the feeling of absolute despair, of utter hopelessness, a cold that froze the soul itself. Her light flickered violently, almost extinguishing. Her mother's vow, her foolish, literal interpretation of it, had led to this. But her mother had said something else. "Your sight is a gift. It will save you." Number. It wouldn't save her. It would save him. With the last of her strength, she pushed past Vorlog, shoving him aside. She threw herself at the throne, her hands landing on Galen's chest, directly over his heart. He was cold, so cold. The shadow veins on his skin writhed under her touch. "Galen, I am here," she sobbed, pressing her forehead against his. "I am so sorry. I was wrong. I was a fool. I love you. Your soul is not a mistake. It is a battlefield, and you are the bravest warrior I have ever known. Please, come back to me." She poured all of her being into her touch, into her words. She opened the core of her own soul, the soft lavender light, and pushed it past the shadows, seeking the last flicker of his silver. She found it, a tiny microscopic spark buried under an ocean of darkness. "Mate," her soul cried out to his. "I claim you. I choose you. I choose the storm. I choose the battle. I choose you." She did not fight the shadow. She embraced the man. And at her soul's cry, at her claim, the spark of silver erupted. It was not a flare. It was an explosion. A tidal wave of pure, brilliant silver light burst from Galen's chest, incinerating the shadow veins on his skin. The cold in the room was banished by a sudden, intense warmth. The despair that had filled the air evaporated like mist in the sun. Galen's eyes, once vacant, snapped open, and they were no longer the cold gray of a winter sky. They were molten silver. He gasped, a deep, shuddering breath, the first true breath of a man reborn. He looked down at Alara, his hands coming up to cover hers on his chest. His soul, once a raging storm, was now a perfect, harmonious balance of brilliant silver light and calm, protective shadow. The darkness was not gone. It had been tamed. It was no longer a curse, but a part of him, controlled by the unshakable strength of his light, a light she had reignited. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice filled with a love and awe that made the very stones sing. Vorlog screamed in rage and terror. The power he had been channeling, now with no vessel to enter, turned back on him. The shadows converged, not on Galen, but on the soulless advisor. "No!" he shrieked. "It is not possible." The void that was his soul imploded, and the shadows he had sought to command consumed him, leaving nothing behind but a whisper of cold air and the echo of a scream. Behind them, Galen stood over the two defeated guards, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his granite soul glowing with fierce pride. Galen's attention was only on Alara. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her from the floor and onto his lap as he sat upon his throne. He held her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. "You saved me," he murmured into her hair. "No," she whispered, her face buried in his chest, breathing in the scent of him, of victory and homecoming. "We saved each other." The Shadow King was dead, and in his place, on the throne of the North, sat a man made of silver and starlight, holding his blind seer, his mate, his queen. The true king had returned. 1 year later, the great hall of the citadel was unrecognizable. The grim gray tapestries depicting battles and conquest had been replaced with vibrant weavings of forest green and sky blue. Sunlight, once a stranger to these walls, now streamed through newly installed windows, illuminating the joyful faces of the court. The air, which had once smelled of fear and cold stone, was now fragrant with wildflowers and roasting meats. It was the king's wedding day. Alara stood beside Galen on the royal dais, not below it. She was dressed in a gown of the softest silk, the color of moonlight, a perfect match for the silver in her husband's eyes. Her hair was woven with the delicate, sweet-smelling moon petals from the queen's garden. She was no longer Ilara the blind Omega. She was Ilara, the soul-sighted queen, and her name was spoken with reverence and love throughout the kingdom. Galen's hand was warm and steady in hers. His soul was a constant, calm presence beside her, a perfect harmony of silver light and gentle shadow. The shadow was his strength, his power as a protector, now fully mastered and guided by the brilliant light of his heart. a light she tended to every day with her love. He was not a man without darkness, but a man who had conquered it, who had integrated it into a stronger, more complete whole. He was the Twilight King, ruling the line between light and dark with wisdom and compassion. Their union had healed more than just the two of them. It had healed the kingdom. Galen's new reign, tempered by Alara's empathy and insight, had transformed the North. The harsh, brutal laws that valued only physical strength had been rewritten. Compassion, truth, and inner strength were now the currencies of the realm. His warriors, once flint-souled and grim, were now led by the steadfastly loyal Galen, and their souls shone with the polished steel of true honor, protecting the weak instead of preying on them. The mating ritual that had once been her greatest humiliation had been abolished, replaced with a festival of celebration where bonds were chosen by the heart, not by a show of strength or a transaction. As the ceremony concluded and the cheers of their people washed over them, Galen leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Are you happy, my queen?" he murmured, his voice a low, loving rumble meant only for her. Alara turned her face toward him, a radiant smile blooming. She reached up, her hand cupping his cheek, feeling the warm, vibrant life beneath his skin. In her mind's eye, she saw his soul, that beautiful, brilliant light, shining just for her. "I see nothing but light," she whispered, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. He kissed her then, a deep, possessive, and utterly loving kiss that sealed their bond in front of all their people. The hall erupted in a joyous roar. Later that evening, they stood on the balcony of their chambers, the cool night air a soft blanket around them. The sky was clear, awash with a million glittering stars. Galen stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "I used to hate the night," he confessed, his voice soft. "It was when the shadows were strongest, when the curse felt like it would finally consume me." Alara leaned back against his strong chest, placing her hands over his. "And now?" "Now," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "It is just the backdrop for my star." She felt a sudden, strange fluttering sensation within her, a tiny new light taking root deep in her soul. It was a light she had never perceived before, small and delicate, but shining with an impossible brightness. It was the color of nascent silver and soft lavender, a perfect fusion of their own soul lights. A gasp escaped her lips. Galen felt her sudden tension. "Ilara? What is it? What do you see?" Tears of pure, unadulterated joy filled her eyes and traced paths down her cheeks. She turned in his arms, her hands moving from his to rest on her own stomach. She looked up at him, her sightless eyes seeing him more clearly than anyone ever could. "Galen," she breathed, her voice shaking with a miracle. "They told me a blind Omega could never carry a strong bloodline. They told me I was barren, a broken thing." Understanding dawned in his silver eyes, followed by a wave of such profound awe and love that it left her breathless. He slowly knelt before her, his large, calloused hands gently covering hers on her stomach. He pressed his ear to where their hands rested, as if he could already hear the impossible. "They were wrong," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He looked up at her, his silver eyes glowing in the starlight. "Everything they ever said about you was wrong. She was not a flaw. She was his strength. She was not a weakness. She was his heart. She was not a curse. She was his salvation and the mother of a new light for the kingdom they had built together." In the heart of the once cold north, a king and queen stood united. their love a beacon that had banished the longest night and promised the dawn of a new, brighter age.